Castlevania Symphony of the Night is widely regarded as one of the finest 2D action games ever made. In a time when developers were enamored with full 3D worlds and expensive pre-rendered cinematics, Symphony of the Night came along and showed us what could really be achieved in 2D using then modern hardware. It may not have been fully appreciated by everyone out of the gate, but in time, it has become a fan favorite. As 3D graphics of that era have become dated in appearance, Symphony of the Night has aged like fine wine. It's also a game which has received one of the most disappointing ports of all time. While the Sega Saturn was known for being a 2D powerhouse, the port of Akumaju Dracula X, Nocturne in the Moonlight, was a crushing disappointment with poor performance and a reduction in visual quality. Just how could the 2D monster that was the Saturn falter? This is DF Retro, and today we're going to explore that very question. Just how did the game work on PlayStation, and what happened with the Sega Saturn version? It's an age-old question, and one we've sought to answer the question to. So join me once more as we return to Castlevania. To start with, Dracula X is a 2D action game drawn by primarily utilizing PlayStation's Sprite command, which essentially uses 8x8 or 16x16 rectangles rendered back to front and drawn into an off-screen buffer. In this game, the majority of the image is composed of these fast rectangles, limited only by the system's fill rate. The color is then determined by a color lookup table. For objects which require rotation, a slower 3D command must be used. Dracula X makes use of 3D for select objects, such as the clock tower and clouds here at the beginning of the game, but it is primarily a fast 2D game. With how the PlayStation draws 2D graphics then, it's possible to use countless layers of parallax and make heavy use of half-transparency throughout. Compared to previous 16-bit games, there is a richness to the visuals and tile sets in use here that we had not seen before in Castlevania. Beyond that, Symphony of the Night features beautifully fluid animation with a huge number of frames for each character. There are plenty of other beautiful 2D games on PlayStation that still look great today, but Symphony of the Night remains one of the most attractive. It's a game as beautiful today as it was back in 1997. But it's the Sega Saturn that was often known as the most powerful 2D system around, so why is it that the Saturn port is so disappointing here? Without discussing with the original programmers, it's difficult to say with 100% certainty, but we have drawn some conclusions based on a close inspection of the game. Before we dig into how the Saturn constructs each scene then, we need to discuss the actual artwork and how it has changed for this port. The PlayStation version of the game uses the system's 256 by 240 display mode, but ultimately only draws 256 by 207 worth of pixels. It's possible that this mode was selected in order to utilize art assets from the PC Engine CD Dracula X title, Rondo of Blood, a system which almost exclusively featured games with 256 pixel width. All of the game's texture objects were created with this resolution in mind. When displayed on a CRT monitor, the image naturally fills the screen with non-square pixels, just as with Nintendo's previous systems, among many others. The Sega Saturn, however, does not support a 256 pixel wide display mode. Its lowest resolution is actually 320 pixels wide. And of course, Dracula X uses 320 by 240. Capcom had previously ported other games to the Saturn from the Super NES, which uses this resolution, and it dealt with this issue by simply pillar boxing the experience, resulting in a narrower overall presentation. While the aspect ratio is off, the end results are quite attractive. And if you're using an external scaler such as the XRGB Mini, it's possible to stretch the image and get something that's closer to the actual aspect ratio we saw in the Super NES. With Dracula X, however, the development team opted to pre-scale all of the game's artwork from 256 pixels wide to 320. In effect, this means that every fourth pixel is repeated. Taken across the entire image then, the results appear highly distorted. You can see this here on the railing in this opening scene, where a perfectly smooth slope on PlayStation is replaced with irregular patterns. This issue affects the game as a whole. It is of course visible in the sprite work as well. Check out the double pixel wide cape on Alucard here. At least things such as text fonts are actually rendered at the appropriate resolution, however. Ultimately though, I believe this mangling of the artwork actually has the greatest impact on the presentation. But of course, there is more to this story. We know the PlayStation version uses the system's fast rectangle sprite mode in order to draw the image, but how are things handled on Saturn? The Sega Saturn features two Hitachi SH2 CPUs and two video display processors, VDP-1 and VDP-2. VDP-1 is used for drawing the main scene, including the sprites, distorted sprites, and other active objects. VDP-1 also has two frame buffers where it can spit out one scene while preparing the next. The VDP-2 then is dedicated to background layers or scenes. VDP-2 can handle up to 5 layers, 4 scrolling layers, and a 5th layer with programmer-defined colored lines. Layers are drawn from tiles and can be scrolled and scaled freely, enabling a wide range of uses. VDP-2 is also responsible for final image composition. In that sense, the information taken from VDP-1's frame buffer actually works as an independent 6th layer. In Dracula X, character sprites, 3D objects, portions of the background, and other active elements in the scene are all handled by VDP-1, while VDP-2 is in charge of certain background layers. On PlayStation, all 2D elements within the scene are treated as textured rectangles, while Saturn can combine the strengths of VDP-1 and 2 when composing the final image. That does not mean they were used as effectively as possible, however. Let's take a look at another high-end 2D game on the Saturn, Kyoyu Gekitai Katsugeki Hen. It's another beautiful game with hand-drawn art, detailed backgrounds, and more. If we move over to an emulator here then, we can actually independently control what is being drawn. If we disable all VDP-2 layers, this is what we are left with. Not much, huh? Just the main sprites and UI elements. Now if we switch back to Dracula X, we actually see something different. After stripping away the VDP-2 background layers, we're actually left with plenty of additional background detail, which is all being handled by VDP-1 using an approach similar to the PlayStation. The Saturn is slower with these operations, however, and offloading additional graphics elements such as the parallax trees here to a separate VDP-2 layer may have improved performance. Moving on, as we attack this creature, another problem becomes evident: half transparency, or the lack thereof. Half transparency is used everywhere in the PlayStation version, but on Saturn those effects use the mesh command instead most of the time. Everything from flames visible during combat to the dialogue boxes used in story sequences make use of this mesh command performed on VDP-1, which basically skips every other pixel in order to create a pseudo-transparent effect. There are ways to achieve proper transparency on the Saturn using different layers in certain modes, but it does come with limitations. Let's take another look at KO here. The waterfalls in this scene are beautifully realized with a full half-transparent effect in play. So how is this possible? Well, in this case, it's simply a separate VDP-2 layer, which does fully support half-transparency. We see a similar effect in the next level, where the glow around these lanterns is created using another VDP-2 layer. So how could this thinking be applied to Dracula X? Well, for starters, how about the dialogue boxes? These text boxes exclusively use the mesh mode and are drawn on VDP-1. Perhaps offloading these to VDP-2 would actually work better. That's not to say VDP-1 cannot do transparency, however. A classic example of this is Guardian Heroes. The cape on this character is transparent, but if you look behind her, you'll actually see that the cape erases other sprites behind it due to the order in which they are drawn. Sprites are rendered back to front, and a transparent portion of a sprite in front will cover up a sprite in back. This final image is then sent to VDP-2, where it's treated by a separate layer. But in the case of Dracula X, this may not have been an issue. There are many other ways that these flames could have been drawn in this scene to look better. Trying to duplicate the method used on the PlayStation just doesn't work here. It's easy to imagine that many of these issues stem from the process of converting the game from PlayStation to Saturn. The way in which it was designed to function simply favors the PlayStation hardware, and would require further reworking to really excel on Saturn. Relying heavily on VDP1 for most of the rendering while avoiding potential tricks ultimately limits what can be achieved here. So how does it actually perform then? I think these earlier moments of the game actually demonstrate very nicely what's happening on the Saturn. Here we actually see the entire scene being rendered using VDP1, and whenever the screen is filled with explosions and sprite scaling, the level of performance cuts in half. Since it does not actually drop frames, however, the entire game begins to play at 50% speed, a very common occurrence back then. And this is all with the reduced graphics here on the Saturn. So of course this footage is running on a real Sega Saturn, but if you choose to play the game on an emulator, the performance is actually much smoother and you'll get a pretty solid 60 frames per second throughout. Just something to note. Now if we move back over to the PlayStation and look at the same scene, we see something different. The game cruises right along at a very stable 60 frames per second, and it even manages to look significantly better due to the extra transparency effects and improved scaling. This is certainly how the game was meant to be seen, which makes sense considering it was developed on this platform to begin with. It really looks and moves so very smoothly here. There is another issue though, loading times. These loading tunnels are used on PS1 in order to smooth over the transitions between areas, but on Saturn, this isn't enough and additional loading screens are required, which does slow down the pace of the game. This applies to the menu as well, which has a noticeable delay when opening and closing. Worse still, the map is hidden in the menu, making it much more tedious to track your progress. Also, if you're using a scaler such as the XRGB Mini, it's important to note that the Saturn version renders its menu at 640 by 240 interlaced mode, which requires the scaler to change display modes. The menu on Saturn does at least feature a nicer font. On PlayStation, the game also uses a higher resolution here with 384 by 240, but it does not require a mode change as it remains in 240p. The map can also be accessed easily by simply tapping the select button. So is the Saturn version still worth checking out with these issues? Well, considering the price, I would say no, but it is a fascinating curiosity nonetheless. We also hope that this helps dispel the myth that the game runs slowly due to the way in which PlayStation renders 2D. Both systems work very similarly in this regard. It's simply that the Saturn performs these operations more slowly while using a dedicated background processor to make up the difference. From this point, a full decade would pass before another port of the game was released. First up is the release of the game on Xbox Live Arcade. It was notable for being the first game to exceed the original 50 megabyte file size limitation of the platform. That said, beyond that, it feels like a pretty basic emulation of the PlayStation version compressed into a smaller file size. It was still novel to have such a game in downloadable format at the time though, but it is missing the original full motion video sequences and defaults to a typical emulator filter. It was certainly nice to have access to the game on a more modern console though, and it's now even compatible with Xbox One. Then, later in 2007, Konami released Castlevania the Dracula X Chronicles for the PlayStation Portable. While this release focused on the remake of Rondo of Blood, it also included 2 unlockables, including the entirety of Symphony of the Night. This port was, of course, based on the PS1 original and features all of the expected visual effects and artwork. The game includes 2 zoom modes, with the first being a 1:1 square pixel mode, while the other simply stretches the image to fill the screen, at least partially. Both modes display a wallpaper behind the game at all times, which, to be honest, can be rather distracting. What's most interesting about this port, however, is its translation. The game was rewritten and re-recorded for the PSP. So this famous scene,
"Die, monster! You don't belong in this world!"
"It was not by my hand that I'm once again given flesh. I was called here by humans who wish to pay me tribute,"
becomes this on PSP.
"Dracula, die now and leave this world. You'll never belong here."
"Oh,
but this world invited me. Your own kind called me forth with praise and tribute.
It is kind of neat to have two different takes on the original script, though. Which one do you think is better? So at this point, we're closing in on the 20th anniversary of Symphony of the Night next year. It's been an amazing 20 years and the game is still a joy to play today. No matter which version you get your hands on, it's a fantastic game. It was also interesting to finally go back and try to understand what it was that went wrong with the Saturn version, and I hope you've gained some insight there as well. And that about wraps things up. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, stay retro.